All right. I'm Christopher Pettengill,
And I'm Rene Brown.
and we're presenting on will oysters enhance habitat quality and management for waterfowl in a restored salt marsh. So through the previous presentations that we've had, it's really clear that freshwater marshes and freshwater wetlands in general are very valuable habitat for waterfowl. But at the same time, we've also seen that people who are looking at estuaries and primarily saltwater environments have found much lower abundances of waterfowl. And part of this is due to the plant species that are present in salt marshes having an overall lower diversity, and also the species that are there not necessarily being as high value for a lot of waterfowl as some of the other types that are present. And so the focus of our research, while in a broad sense, the focus of our research is looking at the value of oysters in a restored setting like this. For me in particular, it'd be like the economic value associated with oysters. For this purpose of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the potential for oysters to improve waterfowl habitat in these salt marsh environments. So our objectives for our research as a whole, to determine the economic benefits from the addition of oysters to this restoration site, both from the biotic effects through the abilities of oysters to alter the community structures that are present, as well through some abiotic effects, such as through their potential, their ability to retain sediment and to improve water quality through biofiltration. We're also intending on comparing oyster growth rates and recruitment rates on different structure types and comparing it with the costs of those structures. And this is separate. This isn't really a separate objective, but something I thought important to mention. We were isolating the effects of oyster addition from other site management actions that are also going to be taking place at the site, and comparing restoration site, the impoundments at this restoration site with locations that are more going to be our reference natural salt marsh systems that are going to have varying levels of oyster density. So we can see whether isolate the effect of the oysters from the effect of the other alterations to this restoration site.
Okay, so for a research site, it's called State Selfish Farm, ground 616, and it is located at Little Edisto Island in South Carolina. So with our impoundment, it basically has 6 impoundments, and we basically categorize them as high marsh, low marsh, and open water. And so for the high marsh, it shows limited evidence of waterfowl. And in the next slide, you're going to see the reasons for that. And for low marsh sites with the mudflat, they do have extensively utilized by birds and depending on the tidal cycle also. And for the open water, occasionally harbor cormorants, herons, and egrets.
Yeah. So this is a layout of what the habitats at the site are expected to occur following tidal restoration. So I'll give you a little bit of the difference between, for example, right now, there is significantly less cover of this open water / mudflat habitat than is seen here. The broad area, that broad rectangle up there is still present. And this area has already been altered to some extent. So there is open water in this location. But generally, there is much less cover of open water right now. These other habitat types, though, are still present, where we have kind of this high marsh location in the periphery, and then you have this low marsh area as one gradually goes towards the rest of the locations.
And as I previously mentioned before, for the high marsh, it is not ideal for waterfowls. So with that, salt marsh sparrows, red-winged blackbirds, marsh wrens are all seen here, but they do not support condition for waterfowl only because it is relatively dry throughout our experiment, and the vegetation that are there now, waterfowl wouldn't be attracted to it. So these doesn't really isn't ideal habitat for waterfowl. However, for the mudflat, they do support abundance of birds. So whenever like there's a few centimeters of water cover the mudflat, birds flock to these basically to forage. They tend to forage in these kind of area. And throughout our experiment, these are actual pictures that we've took. We've recently seen sandpipers, plovers, gulls, herons, and egrets are all seen here throughout our experiment. And this started after the fall. So when it gets warmer, they tend to come here to forage. We haven't seen any waterfowl here at this specific impoundment. So a question we have is, could this site be potential improved for waterfowl?
Okay. So there is previous evidence of waterfowl utilizing tidal mudflats as foraging habitats, though to be fair, I don't believe it's to the same extent as in freshwater systems. This is especially true for tidal wetlands that have a coverage of fresh water for part of the time. Like if it rains a whole lot, there's like a temporary coverage of fresh water on a tidal mudflat. Waterfowl have been found to utilize that when there's that in addition to the salt water.
Okay, so for open water areas, so they do support a small population of native oysters, and so no large reef, basically. So water level do drop during low tide, which relieve more mudflat, which tend to attract more foraging of these birds here. So mussels and fiddle crabs present here in low tides. Egret and shorebirds feed on them when they do become exposed. So we tend to see more shorebirds and waterfalls here when we have lower tides.
So, and this probably should have been on after the slide that comes next, but there are some areas where water depth at this site exceeds that which the primary salt marsh vegetation, which is Scrobolus alterniflorus, can survive. And it's these locations where we are planning on adding these additional oysters and adding structure basically to support the natural colonization of the site by oysters. So deeper water has been found to support diving ducks when their prey, such as aquatic invertebrates and fish, are available. It's our hope that these oysters, the presence of oysters at these sites and the increased abundance of them will increase the amount of available food for waterfowl and other birds through kind of providing habitat. And most diving ducks tend to prefer slack waters or waters with minimal current where they can dive effectively. And the designs of these impoundments sort of line up with that method where they're usually found in flat areas. So in the summer of 2024, Southeast Mitigation, which is the site, which is the restoration firm that we are working with, will hire separate contractors to remove sections of the berms that surround these different impoundments. There's a set of 6 of them, remember. The intent is to restore full uninhibited tidal hydrology to the site, and that additional ditches will allow the impoundments to essentially share water more so than they do currently. And the differences in elevation of the site, which kind of ranges from the highest elevation being at the northern end of the site to the lowest elevation being at the highest elevations at the southern end of the site, and then it slopes to the north going towards the tidal creek, and that will provide some habitat heterogeneity, let's say. Another habitat alteration is going to be the addition of structures to facilitate the growth of oysters at the site. So we have wooden stakes and wire squares, which we are going to be utilizing there. And this is just a general layout of the site. You can kind of see where things are added. So I sort of, in the slide after, I kind of highlight this area. It's not high quality, but this is the area where a section of the berm that sort of separates these two things is going to be removed. So there's already a bit of a tidal channel here, but this is going to be much more significant after that's removed. And that's where a lot of the water is going to be coming into the site from. And there is a water control structure that's there that's kind of like turned off, but it still limits the amount of water that can go in and out of the site and the amount of organisms that can go in and out of the site, because it's basically a drain pipe that's about this wide. So imagine all of the water from a tide coming in and out of a singular pipe. It's restricting a lot of stuff. So in the summer of 2024, there's a bunch of different culverts that are in there that are also going to be taken out to sort of allow the water to flow more freely through a bunch of these impoundments, which are otherwise separated by these giant berms. And we're assuming that following all these site management actions, that there's going to be a similar hydrology between the different sites. So our primary focus of research is how do these oysters improve the ecosystem restoration outcomes at this particular site. Our hypotheses sort of are that there's going to be an increased forage fish and invertebrate abundance at the site, which should create areas of concentrated food for coastal birds, waterfowl, and waders. And the other thing that's somewhat less related to the waterfowl, but oysters can also reduce the concentration of nitrate and phosphate in water, as well as phytoplankton. So both contribute to eutrophication in high amounts. And the effects of eutrophication on waterfowl habitat, I've looked up research on it. It's not as well studied as it necessarily would be for something like fish or organisms that rely on getting oxygen from the water.
What is eutrophication?
Eutrophication is basically all of the compounds that get taken up by bacteria and other organisms that speed up the rate of decomposition, and that leads to decreased levels of dissolved oxygen in the water. So we kind of have a theoretical food web here that I made for some of these relationships are very well defined, but others are not. So oysters tend to provide habitat for things like crabs and shrimp and benthic fish, which cluster to those locations because they're the main source of structure in that environment. Because otherwise, you're basically in a grassland. It also supports sediment stabilization and nutrient retention, which helps the salt marsh cordgrasses and widgeon grasses, which in turn, there are other species like fiddler crabs and periwinkle snails that benefit from that. However, there's also a negative quote, unquote, effect of oysters, which is predominantly on phytoplankton, which would in turn, and this is kind of where we start getting into speculation, would in turn reduce the amount of zooplankton in the water due to less available food for zooplankton that feed on phytoplankton, and therefore potentially less planktivorous fish. So as far as the birds are concerned, our question is, are they taking primarily from these food resources that oysters benefit, or are they taking more from those food resources up there, like the planktivorous fish, that the oysters might have a negative effect on?
Okay, so let's get into our methods. So each month we do go out and we take 100 milliliter of water, and we filter this through a 30 micrometer filter from each impoundment, and we do this consecutively throughout. And with these samples, we process for nitrate and phosphate, and we can say we've run one test sample so far, and these tests for nitrate and phosphate came back non-detectable, which is pretty much as expected because of the salt that's is present in the water samples that we've collected. And additionally, we try to get 1 liter of water that we don't filter, we don't do anything, just to have that as a reference site throughout our experiment to compare these. So with this 1 liter, we use it to process in the lab for suspend solid and chlorophyll using a vacuum filtration onto fiber paper. So the impact of water parameters on oyster growth. So oyster growth and survival are highly dependent on salinity, dissolved oxygen, and concentration of phytoplankton. So with this, as I previously mentioned, this process can be used to measure chlorophyll A. So with salinity, minimum requirement of this is 15 ppt, and so far throughout our samples, it has passed the threshold of all the impoundments. So salinity level is pretty much good throughout our samples and all the impoundments. For temperature, so eye temperature do contribute to low dissolved oxygen. And so we are hoping to reestablish natural tidal flux to the impoundment at the restoration site, and we will reduce temperature dissolved oxygen variabilities. So you could go.
This is just an image of Rene and I out in the field where we're sort of processing through the data that we are collecting. We're taking some in situ water measurements too. So we're using not a HoboWare logger, but like it's just you just instantaneously put it in the water and it's a multi-parameter probe. So it'll take things like pH and conductivity and dissolved oxygen and salinity and all that. And we just take that all at once when we're there in the impoundment. We are hopefully going to have longer term probes that are going to be in there eventually as well, which would be measuring those sorts of variables along with the relative pressure to kind of get an idea as to what the tidal height is on a longer term. And for our invertebrate surveys, we're doing transect lines. I found this really interesting method of sampling for invertebrates, which I thought would be applicable here from Burns et al. That his lab has done, where you go sequentially from wherever your upland location is, and you essentially take a quadrat sort of type sample, but it can be like we use DNets, we use soil cores, that sort of thing. But you take them going down slope from where the upland end of the marsh, salt marsh is to the lower end. So you get the full swath of different invertebrates that are found at different depths or different elevations. And all the invertebrates that we collect are preserved in 70% isopropyl alcohol, and we identify them to the lowest taxonomic level possible. This is just a picture of me out in the field. This was before we really had our actual DNets. So this is just us messing around out there, but I thought I'd include it. It gives you an idea as to what it's like.
Okay, so for our fish samples, how we do this is we set out 6 minnow trap in each impoundment. So in total, will be 36 minnow trap that we set out on a particular day. And so how we do it, we set it out in the morning and we set it for 24 hours. So we try to go between 24 hours to get the results of these. So we set out 6 minnow traps in each impoundment and 1 crab trap in each. And then the next day we go out, collect these samples. So we will weigh each species, we've seen them, count them, and just identify the species. So we try to do this relatively every other month just to not disturb whatever we have in there. So that's how we do that one. And then for the depletion samples, so we use a 50-foot width seine net. So we try to do 5 consecutive sweeps throughout. We catch our samples, we record whatever we've seen in these nets. And we do a 10 cast net throws, which is in 8-foot diameters. So as I mentioned before, the fish, they're identified, they're measured in length and weighed. Oh, and a very important thing, we promptly release them back as soon as we're done with them. We don't harm them. We have them saved in a little foam cooler with water, and we'll just release them as soon as we're done.
And this is just an example of like what the seine net sweep would look like, because this thing being 50 feet long, like how do you actually take a measurement like that? So we just sort of start where one person is up at that end there. One person's sort of at the center point, almost like a fulcrum sort of. And we just make this half moon shape going like 180 degrees and basically just forcing everything to get caught within the net. And that's what we do. That's how you can kind of regulate catch per unit effort using one of these. So here's an image of us doing our bird survey out there. There you go.
Okay, so for a bird survey, we walk along a predetermined set of transect. We use our GPS point to set these points, so we don't have to guess and spell like where to go. We just have them saved. And this is just a marker on the side, like the length of the impoundment that we walk to do our bird survey. So each survey period lasts from sunrise until 3 hours after sunset, because that's when we relatively see a lot of activity with these birds. So during each survey, we record time, location of observer, the distance of the bird, the angle of the bird, the species that we see. We also count the quantity if it's visible. Sometimes we just, guess relatively how much we see, and we notify like the behavior if they're foraging, the 10 of offspring if they're nesting. These are the observations we do for bird survey.
And there's just an image of me trying to look for some of the birds out in impoundments. A lot of these, many sections of them are dry, and so the birds are kind of clustered generally in some very smaller areas of suitable habitat within the larger site. And the other thing that we're doing, which I mentioned earlier, is that we're testing the efficiency of different types of structure at supporting the growth and fecundity of oysters. Oysters are used extensively in coastal restoration, like old oyster shell that's been bleached and stuff like that. However, they're used so much that the demand can actually eclipse supply, and this makes it so that they're less available for people who want to put them out at a larger scale. So we're testing different methods for cost versus oyster colonization rates and growth rates using, we had mentioned the wooden stakes and the wire frames. And we're also looking at phosphate and nitrate loads and the different community structure types of fish and invertebrates. We're actually not of the opinion right now that that is likely going to be very different. The studies that I've seen in the past that do any sorts of comparison between oyster structures, usually the communities of organisms that are present are based on whether there's oysters there or not. It's not based on the exact structure that they're on. So we're assuming that that's going to be similar. And this is kind of this would be like a follow-up. What we agreed to do was just the wire reef stuff and the wooden stakes. But our stakeholders have also mentioned the possibility of using other things as well. So these are different ideas of different structures that we could utilize. And all of these have been shown to recruit oysters individually. They just haven't necessarily been compared between all different kinds to one another. All right, we want to thank Southeast Mitigation, who is a primary source of funding for this project, and Dr. Anderson, as well as Clemson University and the James C. Kennedy Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation Center as a whole for allowing us to do this project.
Thank you, guys. Yeah.
And also Mr. Lee Taylor, who is our contact for Southeast Mitigation as well. All right, so we got a works cited page here if you're interested. Yeah.
You guys have any questions?
Oh, you do have a couple.
Yeah, you can't run yet.
I wasn't expecting to get any.
Since you're focusing on waterfowl use in salt marsh.
Yeah.
Or salt marsh. I think it'd be valuable to look at the historical context of waterfowl use in salt marsh.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's information out.
Yes.
Broadly speaking, indicate. I don't know whether your study is looking at just South Carolina or the entire Atlantic, or what?
Yeah, our primary concern right now is with this particular site, but definitely when comparing like with reference marshes and stuff like that, that's why we're interested in going out to all these reference salt marshes and comparing.
Waterfowl use of salt marsh in South Carolina is pretty well documented to be limited to American black ducks, and now some model duck use, but it's used by a broad array of dabbling ducks, not for foraging habitat, but for escape habitat in certain situations.
Yeah.
And there's historical context about all that, but I mean, historically, I think you find that salt marsh habitat in the coastal zone of South Carolina is going to be limited to black ducks.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, we kind of figured that that might be the case anyway. Like I mentioned at the beginning, there's the issue of waterfowl of the aquatic vegetation that waterfowl tend to really enjoy, really like. It's very limited in these saltwater environments because there's just not a lot of plants that are very well adapted to it. So, like you mentioned, not great foraging habitat, but maybe these other habitat uses may encourage waterfowl to spend some of their time there.
I think, I would suggest you address that point in your write-up.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You mentioned that in this impoundment, there was just a pipe allowing water flow through.
Yeah, because it's a set of 6 impoundments, but the water kind of travels in a weird pathway through some of the impoundments.
Right.
And the majority of the water that's going in there's a tidal creek that's adjacent to it. And then there's just a section where there's like this 18-inch, I don't even think it's metal. I think it's like plastic or something, pipe that comes out of it. And then the water just drains into one of the impoundments. And that's where a lot of the water comes in from.
Right. And are you saying that they're going to take those pipes out?
Basically, and just open up the berm
So
and then,
breach the impoundment.
yeah, basically in a couple spots. So the idea is that it's going to be the same water going in, but there should be more of it going in and out. They say it's supposed to be about 2/3 of a higher tidal cycle than what they have currently.
So you're taking it from a historically managed field to a now broken rice field.
Yeah, essentially.
It was salt marsh historically, and then they converted it to shrimp farm.
That's right, I was going to ask. It was
So
a
now,
shrimp farm.
yeah, the shrimp farm, so now they're going to re-expose cuttings and try to restore some of that salt marsh.
And that's for mitigation credits.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was,